Um, the next presentation will be by Neil Wilkins. He's the head of Migrant Worker Program, Institute for Human Rights and Business. Neil Wilkins is responsible for all aspects of the Institute for Human Rights and Business Migrant Workers Program, and in 2011 helped oversee the development of the Dhaka Principles for Migration with Dignity, a set of human rights-based principles that offer a clear framework for understanding the recruitment and employment of migrant workers worldwide. More recently, Neil has led much of the Institute for Human Rights and Business work around responsible recruitment and the promotion of recruitment models based on the employer pays principle, which prohibits the charging of recruitment fees and costs for workers. Neil also manages the IHRB engagement with the modern slavery agenda and speaks regularly at events focused on forced labor, trafficking, and transparency legislation. He has worked extensively with the construction, apparel, and hospitality sectors, along with participation at intergovernmental events such as the Colombo Process and the Global Forum for Migration and Development. Neil?
Thank you, Datta. And I must remember to send in a much shorter CV next time I'm asked. And if it's okay, I will not turn my video on, as I've been having broadband issues today, and it drains my capacity for broadband. I think that reflecting on some of the previous comments and some of the views of previous speakers, I think we need to really consider that much of this, the problems that we see today are caused by attitudes toward migrant workers, discrimination, prejudice, and a sort of negative view of migrants. And this in some ways allows poor practice to fester, and in some ways as well, criminality is allowed to flourish. If effective supervision of recruitment and employment agencies is lacking, if contracts can be substituted, amended, or ignored at will, why then are we surprised when things like wage theft happen? And we need much more effective supervision of the recruitment and employment agencies being undertaken by government, because there's a limit to where well-meaning initiatives by business can actually take us. And for any people on the call who aren't familiar with the new Montreal recommendations around effective regulation of the recruitment industry, the IOM this year, based on a consultation that took place in Montreal last year, released these Montreal recommendations, which are a roadmap to better regulation. And I think that we all need to be trying to promote that as much as possible. They sit very neatly with the previous ILO's general principles for fair and ethical recruitment. So I would advise colleagues to please have a look at those. Now, I work closely with international brands, and of course, in response to COVID, very often many of the international brands are far more comfortable at the end of the supply chain that's closer to their direct operations. So many of them were able to instigate quite quickly measures within, for instance, their supermarkets and their retail stores to keep their staff and the general public safe, in order that they might be able to keep trading. It becomes much harder at supplier level. We've seen good practice and we've seen poor practice, of course. Good practice would be for companies to honour their contracts with suppliers, of course, ensure prompt payment, and also to perhaps make sure that their attitude towards deadline and deliveries have been flexible. I think that one of the things that business can generally do well is around communications. And so there's a role for business to play here, helping their suppliers gain access to information and how to then offer up and present that information to their migrant workforces. Companies perhaps have better access to the briefings that were being given out by the IOM and ILO and can potentially play a good role in disseminating that information down through their supply chains. They also have some access, though perhaps not as much as is generally thought, to government, but their trade associations do. And I think there's a big role for business to be active within their trade associations to ensure best practice and to help their suppliers implement practical measures. You know, how can you ensure that your workforces are kept safe? And how can the brands use their leverage with their suppliers to ensure that the correct procedures are being put in place there? The difficulties, of course, for the brands in this situation is they're very keen to keep things moving, keep supplies coming into their operations, of course, and they have their own capacity might be limited. Many international brands have laid off their own head office staff, so there's limited capacity there perhaps as well. I would as well like to just talk about a particular group of workers who tend to get forgotten in these discussions. And I think the one thing that coronavirus pandemic has taught us is what is our view of essential workers and frontline workers. And I think one particular group of hidden workers, very often hidden from view, are the transport and logistics staff. And we increasingly are realizing how we suddenly became aware how dependent we are on those hidden workers. And 90% of all goods are transported by sea. And seafarers don't have the best of times in normal situations. They live in cramped spaces, very often poor working and living conditions, and of course now things are far worse. And there's currently 150,000 seafarers with expired contracts trapped at sea because crew changing in many jurisdictions has been prevented either by governments or by companies themselves. If staff are allowed on shore, very often they find that their wages have been withheld, which means they've then got nothing to spend ashore and no money to remit home to families. So families back home are without money. So that's seafarers. Then, of course, there's dock workers. You know, many dock workers are the poorest of the poor migrant workers. Many of them will be in situations of debt bondage through the payment of recruitment fees. It's generally considered that many of them will be in poor working and living conditions. There's a lack of personal protective equipment, and many of them will be very responsible, very dependent on their employers for information, for their visas and for their migration status. For truck drivers, we see similar lacks of personal protective equipment. We've seen many roadside facilities closed down as a security measure. But of course, this means it's very hard for truck drivers to access toilets and sanitation facilities, but also, you know, food stops and things like that as well. They're also facing long waits or increased waits at factories, warehouses, and of course at international borders, while goods and themselves very often get checked. Other areas of logistics, of course, have seen a surge. We've seen an increase, of course, in online shopping, which has meant increased demand in warehousing, and companies like Amazon have announced over 100,000 new staff to be employed in their warehouse operations. But we must wonder how it's possible to accommodate these increases and still keep those warehouse staff, many of whom will be agency, contract and migrant workers. How can we keep those safe? And that perhaps at a company like Amazon, you know, where there's a lot of reputational leverage to worry about, things might, measures might be put in place, but we could imagine what the situation might be like at some of the smaller warehouse operations where they don't face the same sort of reputational pressures. And then of course there's last mile delivery, where we see many workers employed in what we call gig economy jobs, these delivery drivers, some of them self-employed, some of them bogusly self-employed, living that, and they were already living very precarious lives, unable now to turn down work, and big pressures on increased demand for fulfillment. So I just wanted to bring up those workers because these workers really are sort of tier one suppliers to many of the companies, and yet seldom get considered in these ways. And we should perhaps insist that, you know, these workers do enjoy fundamental rights, that they do receive adequate wages, paid in full and on time, that there are maximum working hours set, and health and safety is adhered to, and possibly, you know, some form of universal social protection for those workers as well. And then just finally from me about how we might promote the justice mechanism. I mentioned earlier the role of trade associations, and it is where many businesses can, you know, do have some leverage. How can we get trade associations to perhaps support the mechanism? And could this be suppliers' attitudes to the mechanism, and the fact that some will and some won't have been taking part in some of the things that we would like to see in the justice mechanism? Could that be a criteria for new contracts? If new contracts are being awarded by companies, then could these form part of the criteria through which they assess potential suppliers? Thank you, Datta. You're on mute. Datta, I think you're on mute.
Sir, yours is muted. You please unmute.
Oh, sorry, my apologies. Thank you, Neil, for the highlighting the Montreal recommendations, provision of recruitment and employment agencies, and the role of trade associations, as well as the impacts. And finally, also for highlighting the problem faced by vulnerable workers in many sectors during this pandemic.